International Skills Corporation and the Didactics of Vocational Education. And Dieter Euler is Emeritus Professor of Educational Management at the University of St. Gallen, known for his research in vocational education, social competence development, digital media pedagogy, and design-based educational research. If I've missed something, the two of you, please complete. Thank you for being with us. In the next roughly 30 minutes, Markus and Dieter will have the opportunity to present their viewpoints on the topic of today, one after each other, and they will also have a moment to react on the other's position. Thank you both for being here. And with this, I would like to give the floor to Markus to start the debate.
Well, thank you so much for this, Ingrid and Daniela. Perhaps you could help me to share my screen. Well, that's perfect. Good. I will try to open up my presentation. Yes. What does it look like? Is that fine? All right, cool. Good. Well, thank you so much for hosting this event. I mean, it's really a privilege. You have been announcing this event also in relation to an article that I have published some year ago approximately. And honestly, I knew it would be a bit provocative, but then when I had published it, I wasn't sure whether we would lead to anything or whether we could create a debate. And then luckily, Dieter Euler reacted to this, also writing an article, a counter article, so to speak, on transfer. And then it was taken up both by Daniela, by Fobitz, and also DCD Vet. So that's really a privilege. And it's not saying that I'm right or anything. No, because I think it's important that we are having such a debate from time to time to really wonder, why are we actually doing vet? And that actually takes me right to the first slide. Why supporting vet in international cooperation? Of course, you can say we do it because it may be a priority of partner countries, and increasingly this is a fact. You can also say, well, we do it because it's in line with foreign policy objectives of donor countries, and we can see, well, that's a strong factor. Definitely in Switzerland, this is the case. Switzerland has a foreign policy agenda which is also integrating this motive of exporting dual vet to a certain degree. Then there could be a further reason to do vet, because there is a plausible theory of change. And here we need to say, yes, well, we do love vet because we think it leads to skills, and that there may be some likeliness that people who got the skills will have access to employment and income. We could also do vet because there is evidence that it leads to impact. Yes, and there I think it gets more complicated. I think, honestly, I think here we need to be honest. We actually don't know enough. Much of the evidence that we've got often comes from projects that are implemented under laboratory conditions, and often, well, we are not actually looking at the overall development of education and vocational education training systems. What we know is that doing vet, and particularly dual vet, is quite challenging. And one challenge is that dual vet in core countries, when we are talking about dual vet, is quite unique. And for this also, well, quite difficult to transfer, also in view of some of the key elements. Often people say, well, dual vet is about students spending time at school, but also spending a lot of time in companies. And that's the case in Germany and Switzerland and Austria. And this is very difficult to transfer. One further element here is that young people get access to an upper secondary qualification via employment at a company through a labor contract. And that, as we know, very often is highly contested. At the same time, we can also say that timing matters. The success of dual vet, of vet in countries like Germany, Austria, and Switzerland is due to the fact that in the 20th century, dual vet expanded earlier than academic upper secondary education. So vet diplomas became a standard qualification of middle classes. And through this, we saw those strong ties with the labor market evolving. For instance, recruitment practices that were really looking at vet qualifications. So A second challenge is the theory of change that I've briefly been mentioning above is actually quite tricky. Formal VET, yes, it can lead to sustained social impact, but when doing VET, it needs, in contrast to a general education, to be quite occupation specific and support the development of practical skills. Also, beneficiaries have to be planning to work in these occupations because otherwise it doesn't really make sense. And occupations also have to require some formal training because if only on-the-job training is required, it makes relatively little sense for young people to acquire job-specific formal training. Furthermore, when doing dual, or you can also call it dualized VET, it needs to be aligned with economic, mainly short-term interests of companies and workshops. So companies need to profit in one way or the other during the program or after the training program. For instance, if they are able to retain former apprentices. So if these motives are not given, it will be very difficult for companies to engage. With this in mind, let me try to compare some VET approaches in international cooperation. And here I need to say, this is something I have delved upon in my article that you've been referring to. And I actually haven't only been looking at dual VET in particular. I was actually more interested in like the broad donor strategies in VET. And obviously I'm a bit critical there. So to start with, I briefly would like to talk about something which many of you know. There's been a changing focus in international support to education from the 1960s to 1980s approximately. VET has been the key element of international support to education. Then in the 1990s, also as a result of what the World Bank has been doing, there's been a shift towards primary education. And then post 2007, 2008, post the global financial crisis, which has been leading to high youth unemployment, there has been a renewed interest in vocational education and training. So I'm now trying to look at those traditional approaches first that had been there pre-1990s. Let me do that very quickly. So at that time, from approximately the 1960s onwards, we saw ILO, for instance, World Bank, many other donors focusing on sector-specific training programs, very often catering to specific industries, addressing skill needs of these industries, of key economic sectors, for instance, manufacturing. Very often these were short programs, but also at different skill levels, operators, technicians, etc. And also they came under sector-specific ministries, so very often not under the Ministry of Education, but rather on the Ministry of Textiles, for instance. Some of these key providers have survived until today. As a result of this, we saw some fragmentation of VET provision. What we also saw was diversified secondary education. That has been what the World Bank has been doing mainly through ministries of education, focusing on a broad support of broad upper education with some general education and vocational options. It has been criticized, noticeably also by the World Bank, for leading to a comparatively low rate of return. So after 2007, after this renaissance of VET in international cooperation, we saw the emergence of mainly two key approaches. Of course, it would be more complex, but I'm focusing on these two. One of that, in the focus of many donors, has been poverty-oriented, mainly non-formal VET, focusing on mostly short courses, also sometimes with the recognition of prior learning, RPL, focusing on access to employment and income, mainly for socially and economically disadvantaged people, including learners with uncompleted basic education. So that's the pro-poor focus very much. The challenge here is that it's unclear whether people are really benefiting from a training, but also from qualifications in sector where normally informal training dominates. So that the incentive to actually undergo this kind of training it's not always there. At the same time, we see a lot of sophisticated project designs, but in the end, when the projects are phasing out, very often we see a lack of sustainable financing mechanisms. So then we often ending up with poor training for poor people. Another approach that we see, and very often it's being promoted by governments. It's formal upper secondary VET, trying to expanding this. And here the focus is often on permeability. Telling people that, well, you can do VET, but also you get access to higher education. So that's a key promise. And this is a strategy to undermine excessive growth of academic upper secondary education. The challenge here is it may be a good, nice idea, but there are limited incentives for learners to actually develop practical skills. And that in particular is a challenge for dual VET. We see this in so many countries, and particularly in Southeastern Europe, for instance, where this has been promoted, but also in many other parts of the world. So what I do propose here is what I would call, it's a bit complicated, the sector-specific an approach that focuses on sector-specific vocational programs at post-secondary and tertiary levels. So focusing really at technician level and above, admitting also that there may be a blurring of boundaries between VET and higher education. So the theory of change may be somewhat different. Here we say, well, people will get higher skills at mid-level, so to speak, and through this, companies are improving better products, better processes, it's more productive, and in the end, because companies are better, it will create more jobs, so there would be broader access to employment and income, also for the poor. Of course, this requires a focus on critical skill needs of sectors with high employment potential. And what is important here is also, of course, that there can be public, but also private providers, sometimes also universities. Because, well, in many countries that we work, when we look at this kind of level, higher vocational education and training is simply not there. So it's rather done at the universities. Obviously, also because I'm talking about private providers, there's a risk of social inequalities. So what would be needed here are really funding mechanisms that also address or mitigate those social inequalities that I have just been talking about. And it is important to really prioritize critical economic sectors. And there it's important not to wait for the private sector to do something, but to say, to ask, well, where is the private sector not yet offering something, so that public authorities and in support with donors is really moving forward, trying to fill those gaps. And of course, dualization, the cooperation between industry, training, and VET, of course, that's very important. And furthermore, of course, I also do believe, because I don't emphasize this part of pro-poor upper secondary VET so much, I think there is still a very, very high need for support to solid basic education, mainly up to lower secondary education. Because I think this also prepares young people in a very, very broad way for the future challenges of labor markets. And with this, yes, I'm handing over to Dieter. Thank you.
Thank you, Markus. You handed over to Dieter, but I take the word just
yes,
one moment. Thanks for the overview and for highlighting the challenges and proposing this alternative approach. I now hand also over to Dieter. You have a few moments to react to the points raised during this first intervention of Markus, and then please dive deeper into your arguments. A warm welcome, and I hand over to you.
Thanks, Ingrid. Thanks, Markus, for this presentation. To be transparent, I have to say that we exchanged our presentation beforehand, so I knew already what Markus was talking about. So we are well aware on the arguments of the other. So, but before addressing his presentation, let me make a preliminary remark. In my opinion, as Markus already pointed out, this debate is not about who is right or wrong, or which point of view is superior to the other. Rather, I assume that every position has its merits and fits the condition well in some countries and less so in others. So there's no such thing as an one-size-fits-all approach. So every country is very specific in one sense, and it gets closer to Markus' position, or closer to my position. So what I wanted to stress is that we are not in a beauty context, but we should strive for discourse in the best scientific tradition. With this in mind, I can emphasize that I agree with many of the descriptive comments Markus pointed out. In particular, I agree that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, as already said, to development partnerships. By the way, this is not only true for the target countries of the development partnerships, but also between and within the dual VET core countries. There are considerable differences between dual VET in Switzerland, in Germany, in Austria. And there are also considerable differences within the countries in terms of the various economic sectors and occupations. So what to point it out is the dual VET of bankers is different to the dual VET of bakers. So there's many differences there. I would also like to highlight the normative statement that development cooperation should be geared towards sustainable systemic change that leads to the desired social and economic impact. And I would add that it should also be geared towards the individual development of people in the target countries. However, I very much doubt that shifting development partnership efforts to the latest stage of education, which is the post-secondary and tertiary sector, would have the desired social, economic, and structural systemic impact. Due to time constraints, I would like to limit myself to 3 reasons for this skepticism. Firstly, Markus wants to shift the resources of the development partnership to the tertiary sector. Universities and private providers should be supported in enriching their programs with vocational content. This would have the implication that those social groups that are already privileged in terms of education, the so-called well-off middle class, would be very much favored. Those who, due to their social background, do not gain access to tertiary education programs would not be able to benefit from the vocational training opportunities that prepare them for a qualified job. As a result, VET in this concept has a rather exclusive than integrative effect in terms of social objectives. And financial contributions or grants cannot compensate for this inequality, as many people from disadvantaged backgrounds do not even make it to the tertiary sector. Second reason, a second argument, this social effect is reinforced by the fact that Markus' approach leaves VET on the secondary level untouched. Depending on the country, this means that school-based programs or short-term courses prevail. This would mean that we would continue to send many young people to programs that are irrelevant for the labor market. As a result, many young people without academic ambitions are not provided with the opportunity to develop their talents and aspirations after leaving school. In the development of young people, the transition from school to work is highly sensitive and crucial in laying the foundations for skilled and decent employment. The focus, therefore, should be on making this phase in the individual development process of young people as effective as possible. Third and final argument, the implementation of Markus' approach requires a massive reshaping of the universities in the respective country. On the one hand, this concerns the change towards practical disciplines, such as engineering or business administration, and on the other, the change from research-oriented to vocationally oriented degree programs. After decades of experience in different universities, I think the quote from a university professor is worth considering. He once said, "It's easier to move a cemetery than to change a university." To put it gently, implementation of Markus' ideas, therefore, does not seem very easy to me. In conclusion, while I agree with many of the descriptive and analytical statements in Markus' position, I'm convinced that the proposed reorientation will not help achieve the ambitious goals of development cooperation. So that's, I hope I stick to the time frame, 5 minutes. Perfect. I can then continue to introduce my position. For that reason, I also share the screen. Let me do that. Hopefully you can see the slide. I see a confirmation here. So what alternative do I suggest? Before we got lost in the details, I would like to point out what I consider to be the key question and outline the different answers given by Markus and myself. How can development partnerships most effectively impact on, firstly, achieving economic and social goals, and secondly, building sustainable vocational training structures? This is the ambition, and at the same time, this is the yardstick for the assessment of any conceptual approach. Markus puts his main emphasis on strengthening the tertiary sector, especially universities, with regard to vocational contact. Beyond, he argues for more efforts in upskilling employees and as a means to fight for poverty reduction, strengthening basic education. My approach is different. My main concern is to move VET programs in the upper secondary sector closer to the reality of the workplace. This should be done in a systematic way, resulting in an approach I call dualizing school-based VET programs. Correspondingly, reform initiatives should focus on making VET governance and policy as robust and sustainable as possible. Why to focus on dualizing VET programs? And again, I give 3 reasons for that. First one, for school leavers in the age cohort of 14 to 18, the transition from school to employment is a formative and fundamental phase for a stable working life. Such a crucial interface should be designed in the best possible way. In every country, the transition from compulsory schooling to work is a crucial phase in life. This is particularly true for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who do not have the opportunity to embark on an academic career. These young people often end up as unskilled workers because vocational training programs at secondary level do not offer them adequate opportunities. Not addressing their needs leaves them behind, increases their risk of unemployment, and ignores their talent for the development of the economy and the labor market. Secondly, basic vocational qualifications aligned with labor market needs are the foundation for the ability to adapt to constant changes in society and economy. Without basic skilling, there can be no upskilling. VET today and even more in the future should prepare people for a volatile future with continuous and sometimes disruptive changes on the labor market. This requires a solid foundation in terms of basic skilling provided as early as possible after school. And last but not least, the third reason, most countries already have expensive VET structures at the secondary level. In many countries, there are school-based VET programs, very expensive, that do not provide any relevant qualifications from an economic perspective. These structures can either be perpetuated at comparatively high expense, or they can be qualitatively improved by the inclusion of practical phases. And dualization of VET programs can lead both to higher quality, often with less state funding. From the perspective of the state, dualized VET is less expensive than any VET program completely operated at school, be it at secondary schools, at vet schools, or be it at universities. How can the dualization of vocational education and training be implemented? Bringing vet programs in the secondary level closer to the reality of the labor market, to the workplace, in my approach, means to gradually dualize school-based vet programs. So it's not a binary situation, school-based vet or dual vet, but it's a gradual enrichment of the school-based vet program by practical and work-based phases of different kind. Let me explain the approach by a country example. In Albania, where I've been working for quite some time now, 2 projects funded by the Swiss Development Corporation. They started in 2015 to enrich existing school-based programs by increasingly more components of work-based learning. Schools were prepared to include practical phases in the curricula, for example, by inviting practitioners to the school, by organizing internships, or by systematic training phases in the companies. Correspondingly, the vet schools established so-called development units with different functions. One such function is the business relationship management, namely approaching companies to engage in the provision of vet programs. The approach turned out to be very successful with the 10 pilot schools. There are 35 schools, vet schools in Albania, and 10 were selected as pilot schools there. In 2023, the project went one step further. They started a so-called transfer phase, adapting the experiences of the pilot schools to further schools. And based on the experiences, the Prime Minister announced the start of dual vet programs from the academic year 2025-26 on. The learners switch then from student to employee status, receive a training contract, an apprenticeship contract, and remuneration, and many other things. For that purpose, the regulatory framework was adapted, new curricula have been developed, and many, many things more. So this it's not a lab situation, it's a practice situation in one country. As I said, not one size fits all, but in that case, it seems to work quite well. One should also recognize that it took quite some time to take this pathway and to end up at the status quo I just described. To conclude, I would like to, in a nutshell, emphasize 3 conclusions. As the Albanian example shows, the dualization of vet at secondary level can make vet a strong pillar in the realization of economic and social objectives. Secondly, it can make vet programs relevant for the business sector. And in that sense, it gives companies good reasons to get engaged in that. And last but not least, it provides young people from disadvantaged backgrounds with qualifications that enable them to find qualified employment and decent work. In that sense, I stop without ending the discussion. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dieter, for sharing your approach with us. Before we move to the panel, I would like to give Markus the opportunity to react. What do you think about it?
Well, thank you so much, Dieter, for this. Also, thank you so much for reacting in written already to my points. And of course, it's always difficult to disagree with you. I think you made very, very important points. You made one thing that comes to my mind is that, well, in an ideal world, I would actually really support your approach very much. So, I mean, basically also looking honestly from the Swiss or the German background, thinking of what has been tried out in many different contexts, I think, yes, well, vet at upper secondary education, at upper secondary level, that would be actually an ideal scenario, also in terms of further upskilling, etc. The challenge I see there is really that one has been trying to do so much, in particular this area, and it's actually the approach that I have mentioned as the second current one, expanding upper secondary WET. And what we see in many contexts is that governments and trying to make this part of the VET system or of the education system more attractive by telling people, well, you will get some vocational skills, but afterwards you will still have the opportunity to go to higher education. And that is the case in so many countries that I've come across, and it's also a big issue in Southeastern Europe. And so that's why I would love to see the development of such programs. I would love to see more, but I'm not so sure how likely this is. Now, when it comes to the fact of dualization, I think, well, clear. I think that's an aspect that always needs to be there as soon as we, however, involve companies, and I think that's obvious. I think that's also very much in line with your thinking. There needs to be an incentives for companies to engage, and very often when it comes to upper secondary WET, the time actually that can be spent realistically in companies, even if we try to reform it to a certain degree, is still limited. So often then students don't spend very much time at those companies because they need to acquire those more academic skills, which undermines the possibility to actually engage, to actually develop those practical skills. Now, when it comes to more, my proposed framework, I think it's important to say that I'm not only looking at universities, definitely not. I try to make the point, well, depending on the context, it may be post-secondary education, perhaps it may be universities, perhaps it is bachelor programs, but perhaps it's also about different programs that are offered by universities. So that really depends on the context. And that's the important point there. And yeah, I think with this I think I leave it to these few observations.
Thank you very much, the two of you. It was extremely interesting to listen to your debate. And now we would like to